Most of us keep our e-mountain bikes nice and clean, and we also do a little bit of maintenance here and there. But once in a while, it's worth doing a deep clean on components such as your drivetrain. One, it's going to make your bike work more efficiently, and two, it's going to make those expensive components last a lot longer. So today, we're doing a deep clean on the drivetrain. So tools you will need for this job. In today's video, we'll be using a range of cleaning products from Mech. To clean the components, we've got a drivetrain degreaser, which will remove all the oil and grime. Then to lubricate the drivetrain at the end, we have a wet chain lube, as it's currently winter here in the UK. We also have some grease to apply on threads like the derailleur and the rear wheel axle to avoid any seizing in the future. Gloves to protect your hands from the grime off the bike. Variety of Allen keys for removing those components. A selection of brushes to work the grime off the drivetrain. I have some clear tubs here left over from the takeaway to put components in to let them soak in degreaser. A fresh gear cable, super easy to replace and simple maintenance. A quick link to join my chain safely, a fresh new one, not the old one. Quick link pliers for easy chain link removal. Chain whip cassette tool to remove my cassette. And a chain checker. Last thing you want to be doing is cleaning a worn out chain. Check this one before you clean. Now firstly, you don't want to be working on a dirty bike, so make sure you rinse that bike off and it is pretty much spotless because you don't want all that dirt falling off onto your freshly cleaned components. Secondly, make sure it's switched off and then do a quick inspection of the components, a visual one on things like the cassette, and use a tool like a chain checker to make sure you're not wasting your time cleaning worn out components because you don't want to be doing that. Right, firstly, we're going to take the chain off of the bike. Now, tools we're going to need for this one are going to be your quick link pliers. Then all we're going to try and do is find the quick link on the chain. So cycle it round until you see a link that looks a lot different to the others. You're going to see a bit of a gap in it, and it's usually quite a different shape. So once you've located that quick link, you just put the pliers either side of that and give it a quick squeeze together, and you'll hear that quick link break. Then you can just support the chain, give it a little bit of a wiggle, and you should see that chain break fairly easily. So if you're running the Shimano Mech, you want to turn that clutch off. You just want to find the lever, give it a click forward, and that will disengage the tension in the cage. If you're running SRAM Mech, it's a simple push lock button. You find a lock pin, you push that, and it will hold that cage, again, taking that tension out of the system, allowing that chain to be nice and free. Right, we've got the quick link removed from the chain. Now it's worth keeping this as a spare, maybe stick it in your riding pack, something like that, but don't go fitting it to your freshly cleaned chain because these are actually single-use items only. Make sure you stick a fresh quick link in once you rejoin that. Right, with that chain broken, it's time to remove the chain from the system. Now you can either go from the front chainring and pedal it off. It's probably going to be the easiest option because you'll find that if you're trying to back pedal that motor, there's a lot of friction actually. So we've got the chain removed. Now I'm just going to stick this in a fresh pot of degreaser I've got over there and just let it soak because the chain is something that I want to have the most time spent on when I'm cleaning it. Right, so we've got the chain in the degreaser. Then it's worth just getting in there with a brush, just agitate it a little bit and let that degreaser do its work. Already you can see my chain literally disappearing in all that gunk. Now I know this is doing its job well, so I'm going to move on to some other components. Right, now it's time to remove the rear wheel out of the Mech, so just remove your axle, pretty simple on this one, wind it out and drop that back wheel out of the way. Now with the rear wheel out of the way, it's a really great time just to inspect the magnet on your rear wheel and of course that speed sensor wiring. Just make sure it's nice and clean and nice and secure too. Okay, now it's time to remove the rear derailleur off of the bike too. Now usually you've got a bolt holding it on to the derailleur hanger, usually a 5mm Allen key. Then of course you've got your cable clamp too. Now a lot of gear cables will have a crimp on the end of the cable. Now you simply just give that a bit of a squeeze and a bit of a pull and it should come off really easily. Put that to the side, you won't be needing that again. Then we locate the cable clamp. We're going to undo that, 4mm on this XT rear Mech. Right, so that is disengaged. Then it is a simple case of just getting into the derailleur bolt itself. So locate that in there and then just turn this nice and easy. You can see that wind out the frame. Just support the derailleur as well to make sure you're not going to be damaging the threads. That's that bolt undone. And simply pull the cable out of the derailleur, and that's it, removed from the bike, easy as that. Right, so we've got the derailleur moved from the bike, then it's time just to whip these jockey wheels out. Now, it's just a good idea to remove these from the derailleur before you start attacking it with degreaser, because there's a lot of grease and sometimes these have some special coatings on the bushings, so take those bolts out. So the jockey wheels just slide out of the cage. Now it's just worth noting which one is the upper and the lower jockey wheels, because they are different, and if you confuse them, it's definitely going to cause problems when it comes to rebuilding and shifting your gears. Put them up nice and safe, and we're going to come back to those a little bit later. Then once the jockey wheels are removed, I'm just going to put the derailleur into another one of these clear tubs and just give it a quick spray with degreaser all over, just to make sure I'm going to get all that grime off. Once I'm happy that's nice and coated, I'm going to leave that, and then we're going to move on to the cassette. Right, moving on to the cassette then, it's worth doing a quick visual inspection on this also. Just have a quick look at the teeth on there. Just make sure they're not too pointy or spiky, particularly on these higher, bigger cogs on the cassette. And also just check for damaged teeth too. Now, if you look at the smaller cogs on the cassette, you just want to make sure that they're not worn. It's quite hard to do this visually, but if you're riding your bike, usually if that cassette is worn, you're going to experience the gears jumping, especially under load when you go to sprint in these smaller gears. So if it is like that, I'm afraid it's fit for the bin, and you shouldn't waste your time cleaning it. Right, to remove the cassette, you're going to need some simple tools. A cassette removal tool, which fits into the spline on that lock ring, then a chain whip, which is to wrap around the cassette to stop it moving, because if you don't have that, it's simply going to turn. Now we've got the chain tool wrapped around the cassette, it's time to get your spanner or your bar onto the cassette tool and just oppose that, and you'll feel it undo nicely. And once you've got that undone, you simply just wind the center of the cassette out. The lock ring will just come straight out. This is obviously for a Shimano system. If you've got a SRAM XD cassette on your bike, as you undo this, the whole cassette will lift off that free hub body. But with the Shimano system, even with the newer micro spline, you've got to remove the cassette one cog at a time. So just gently remove that and just try and keep it in order. I basically just keep it on my fingers as I take it off, just to make sure I'm not losing any of those parts. So if you see a spacer, just make sure you pull that off, and it comes off nice and easy. Well, that micro spline cassette come off super easy. Now, if you've got the older Shimano HG free hub body with the 8 or 9 splines on there, you might find your cassette is stuck on there a little bit firmer than that. Now you need to apply a little bit more force to get this off, or maybe a bit of persuasion with some couple of chain whips can sometimes move that cassette and work it off that free hub body a little bit easier. Now it's time to put that cassette into some degreaser and get busy with that. Now, the only part of the drivetrain that is left on the bike is the front chainring. Now, the way the chainring mounts to your crank arms is going to vary across lots of different models. Now, on this, it's a one-piece spider, so I'm not really going to gain much by removing the cranks and pulling that chainring off just to clean it. I'm going to do a visual inspection of it, inspecting the teeth again to make sure they're not too pointed or worn. And then I'm just going to spray some degreaser around that just to do its work. And then I'm going to clean that from the inside and the outside. It's just going to save me all that hassle of removing that chainring from the bike. So with the degreaser applied, I'm just going to run a stiff brush around there, really agitating all that dirt off of the chainring. If there's any really stiff gunk on there, you can actually just use a flat blade screwdriver just to run around in each one of those teeth, just to get all that really deep ingrained grime out. Just go around one by one. It's a really great way of inspecting the chainring too. Just let that degreaser work, and that grime should come off super easy. Don't forget to do the back of the chainring too, as well as the front. That way it's going to be nice and clean, ready to install that freshly cleaned drivetrain onto. Right, whilst that lot's soaking, it's time to pay a little bit of attention to the jockey wheels. Now, in the jockey wheels, you're going to find two little bushes that usually will just push out the center of the bearing with a little bit of persuasion. Then with the bushings out the way, just give those bearings a quick spin just to make sure they're running nice and free. Then just get a flat blade screwdriver and just pick all that gunk off of the jockey wheels. Just run it round. You should see that fall off nice and easy. If it is a bit stubborn, you can of course use a little bit of degreaser on there. Just be sure to keep it away from those bearings. Right now I've let these components soak in degreaser for around 20 minutes, so I know it's definitely done its job. I've agitated it with a stiff brush. Now all I need to do is clean it under some fresh, clean water, then of course dry it off. Right, now that's all the components nice, clean and dry. You definitely want to pay particular attention to the chain, because if you go oil in a wet chain, you're simply going to lock all that moisture in and you're going to be back to square one with a rusty chain instead of a nice clean one. Right, now we're going to install the components back onto the bike, and essentially it's just a reverse procedure of what you did to remove them. So we're going to start with the cassette. Right, first up, we're just going to apply a little bit of grease to that free hub body. Particularly if you've got that XD model, you just want to put a bit of a coat on there, just going to allow that cassette to move off that free hub body a little bit easier. Just locating that master spline, I can see it's just there. That's lined up nicely. Then I'm just going to put the cogs on in reverse order too. Just make sure if you've got any spacers in between your cassette and the next cog, be sure to be fitting those. And the last part to go on is going to be your lock ring. You can of course just apply a little bit of grease to this as well, just to make sure it is nicely lubricated. And just start that by hand first before you start putting a tool on there, just to make sure it's nicely engaged. Should do up nice and easy. And as you increase that tension, you'll hear those ratcheted marks start doing up. Then it's time to get the tool on there and crank it up to the manufacturer's specification. Once you've done the lock ring up, it's time to give that cassette a quick spin, just to make sure it's nice and central and there's nothing out of line. Also make sure the gap between each cog is nice and uniform too. There shouldn't be any big gaps in there. If there is, chances are you've messed up putting the spacer in where it shouldn't be and made that gap too big. So take it apart and just make sure you've got a nice gap between each one. Right now it's time to reassemble the rear mech. We've got a nice clean body here. Then we've got the cage and of course our nice fresh clean jockey wheels too. Now just remember I said not to mix those jockey wheels up, so make sure the lower is going to the lower part of the cage and the upper into the upper. Just apply a little bit of thread lock to those bolts as well before you tighten those up, just because if they drop out it could be the end of your ride. So make sure they're nice and torqued up to the manufacturer's specifications too. Give the jockey wheels a quick spin just to make sure they're spinning nice and freely. Then it's time to stick it onto the bike. So when you're installing the mech back onto the bike, there's a couple of things you need to note. Just make sure that this little part is located back to the B tension screw before you screw it back into the bike. Just make sure that this B tension tab sits behind the little cutaway in the derailleur hanger. So just line it up nice and smoothly. Then just take some care when you install that derailleur into the bike, because it's really easy to cross thread a derailleur into your hanger, and if you write that off, it's going to be the end of your ride before it's even begun. So just go nice and steady, make sure it's nice and symmetrical. Just take those first few turns nice and easy. Check that lock tab is nicely behind the part of the dropout. Then you'll see it butt up, just give that derailleur a little push and then just tension it nicely so it's sat in place, ready to reinstall that fresh new cable. Now when it comes to replacing the cable into the derailleur, you're probably going to find that the original cable is probably pretty frayed, and it can become an absolute nightmare, particularly on SRAM derailleurs, to try and thread this back all through the cable routing on the rear derailleur. So I suggest fitting a fresh one. It's a lot simpler and it is a good thing to do. You know, you've got a fresh cable in there, it's not going to snap. So it's pretty simple with this one. You're just going to remove the dust cover off of your Shimano shifter, take that plug out. Right, so I'm pushing the cable from the derailleur end and I can see it coming out of the shifter. So you just gently pull this and that's the old cable out. It's a simple case then of just putting the fresh one in reverse order. So just take a peek into that shifter, locate the hole which is slide the cable in and just feed it through. It should be nice and easily going through into there. Then just keep an eye by your rear mech for that cable coming out. Once it comes out of the rear mech cable, you can pull it through pretty simply. Now a little part that may be in your derailleur still is going to be the cable ferrule. Now you need to make sure that definitely goes on the end of the outer gear cable, because if it doesn't, you're soon going to be ripping that outer cable to shreds. So that goes on, push that onto the outer cable, then just thread the cable back through into the rear mech as per how you removed it. Sometimes you've got to give them a little bit of a tweak just to get it to sit in there nicely. Then once it's threaded through, you just simply add a little bit of tension to the outer cable and just nip that cable tension up. You're probably going to need some adjustment up on the barrel adjuster once you've got the wheel and the cassette all back in, just to fine tune those gears, but that should be a good base starting point. Right now it's time to reinstall the back wheel into the bike. Just pull the rear mech out of the way. Just make sure that that rotor is going into the caliper nicely and lined up. Give it a little wiggle. Right, I can see that's firmly in the dropouts now. Insert my axle and then just do that up. Then the back wheel is going to be nicely ready to go. Right now it's time to install your freshly clean chain. Now a couple of points to note on this: if you're running a Shimano chain, you want to make sure that the Shimano logos is facing out from the bike. If you install it the wrong way, you're going to run into problems. And some other chains are going to have directional markers too, so just make sure you are definitely installing it the right way. I like to start on the rear jockey wheel, then just feed it through onto the other jockey wheel. Can become a little bit of a time-consuming exercise this, but once you get it sorted, you'll soon learn a few little tricks. So I'm just going to pull a load up to there, so I've got a load of excess chain, then hook it onto the cassette. That's going to stop it falling back through. Then I'm going to feed it round onto the front chainring. And a little thing to do here is just put it onto the chainring, give it a little crank, and it should just pull it through quite nicely. Once that's on, just hold that, cycle the crank round, and then you're going to be at the bottom ready to install that fresh quick link. So we put one end in to the blunt end and the other into the other end. So with the Shimano link, simply you put the two links together, line them up nice, and then just get them in situ. Now you can click them into place as they are, but I like to pull that link round to the top of the drivetrain. So just cycle it through the derailleur and the cassette till you see it appear at the top. It may jump around a little bit, but as you can see, that quick link is at the top. All you need to do is hold onto the back brake or hold the back wheel, apply a little bit of pressure to the crank, and you hear it click into place. That means that it's going to go nowhere and is ready to go out and ride. Right now it's time to apply some lube to your freshly cleaned spanking chain. Now here in the UK it is winter right now, so I need to be applying a bit of wet lube to my chain. Obviously if you're in drier climates, you should be using dry lube. So just cycle that chain round, just applying a bit of lube as you go. Make sure it's coating all that links to the inside of the chain. You don't want to be applying chain lube to the outside of the chain because it's simply going to fall off. You just need to lube where that chain is contacting the components. And lastly, it's just those finishing touches to do to your gears, just to make sure they're shifting properly after that new cable install. So just shift on the shifter. If you're not getting a crisp shift, then it's time to add a little bit of tension to that cable on the barrel adjuster. Just turn it out, increasing that cable tension, and then try that shift again. One click at the shifter should denote a crisp change on the cassette. So just check your downshifts too. And again, there is no reason to be reaching down and adjusting the rear derailleur at all. All the adjustment is done up at the shifter end. And lastly, all you need to do once that shifting is nice and crisp is just add a fresh new crimp to the end of that new inner gear cable. So there we go, a deep clean on your drivetrain. It definitely makes a big difference. It's going to make those components last a lot longer and make your bike run a lot smoother, possibly eke a little bit more range out of your battery. But we'd love to hear from you in the comments down below if you've got any hacks on drivetrain maintenance, or how you go about, the different lubes, or maybe how you go about looking after your drivetrain. Love to hear that. Give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed today's video. Make sure you subscribe to us here on EMBN, and we shall see you soon.